The lights were blinding. The crowd at the Las Vegas Hilton was roaring, their cheers shaking the stage. Elvis Presley stood at the microphone, the king of rock and roll, every eye locked on him. He lifted his hand to signal the band. The opening chords of a love ballad, one of his most treasured songs, echoed through the showroom. But then something happened. In the glittering sea of faces, his gaze locked on a sight he never expected. Priscilla, his Priscilla. She was sitting in the audience, her posture composed, her beauty undeniable, but she wasn't alone. There was a man by her side, leaning too close, laughing too easily. Their familiarity was unmistakable. Elvis froze, his lips parted, but no sound came out. The words, the melody, the song that was meant to flow from his soul died on the spot. The band waited, confused. The audience thought it was part of the act. But those who watched closely could see it. Elvis Presley, the man who could command tens of thousands with a single note, was paralyzed by what he had just seen. And then, in an instant that would echo for years, Elvis made a decision. He skipped the song. He moved to the next number as though nothing had happened. But deep inside, something had broken. What Elvis did after that moment, the choices he made, the pain he carried, would ripple through the rest of his life. And the truth of who that man was and what that silence on stage really meant reveals a side of Elvis Presley that few ever knew. To understand that night, when Elvis Presley saw Priscilla with another man and chose silence over song, you have to step back. You have to go to the beginning of their story, because that silence wasn't born on stage. It had been building for years, layered with love, sacrifice, suspicion, and the unbearable weight of living in a world where every move was judged, every secret magnified, and every longing scrutinized. Elvis first met Priscilla Beaulieu in 1959. He was stationed in Germany with the U.S. Army, far from Graceland, far from the screaming crowds that defined his young stardom. Priscilla was just 14 at the time, the stepdaughter of an Air Force officer. She was shy, soft-spoken, and almost impossibly young, but Elvis was drawn to her presence. Their relationship began under circumstances already charged with controversy. An older, world-famous rock star and a teenage girl still navigating her adolescence. For Elvis, Priscilla represented something untouched by fame, something pure in a life already chaotic with temptation and attention. For Priscilla, Elvis was not just a man, but a living legend, charming, protective, and impossibly magnetic. Their courtship was long, complicated, and carefully shielded from the public eye. Elvis brought her to Graceland when she was still a teenager, shaping her world, controlling her surroundings, keeping her close while grooming her for the role he imagined she might play in his life. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale, the king and his princess, but beneath that sheen was a storm waiting to break. Because Elvis Presley was not a man built for monogamy, fame had thrust him into the arms of adoring women wherever he went. His charm, his looks, his aura, it was impossible for him to walk into a room without drawing desire. And while Priscilla remained faithful, isolated, and devoted, Elvis was often unfaithful, living out impulses he excused as just part of the lifestyle. Still in 1967, after nearly 8 years of waiting, they married. The wedding was dazzling, a media frenzy. Photographers flashed cameras as Priscilla, in her beaded gown, smiled beside Elvis, who wore a sleek black tuxedo. To the world, they were perfection. To Priscilla, it felt like at last, after years of waiting, she had fully claimed the man she had given her youth to. But the cracks showed quickly. Within a year, Lisa Marie was born. Priscilla adored her daughter, but the strain on the marriage deepened. Elvis's career was in full swing, from films to stage performances, and along with it came the temptations, co-stars, showgirls, fleeting affairs that left Priscilla waiting at Graceland, heartbroken but silent. She began to realize that being Mrs. Elvis Presley meant more than wearing a ring. It meant living with loneliness, with the ache of watching the man you love belong not just to you, but to millions. She once confessed later in interviews that she often felt like a living doll, molded, directed, expected to fit into the image Elvis envisioned. And yet there was love. Elvis did care deeply for Priscilla. He confided in her, trusted her, leaned on her. He wrote tender letters when apart. He brought her into his inner circle, guarding her from outsiders, but with that love came control. Priscilla was expected to remain loyal, obedient, and silent, no matter what she saw or heard. The imbalance could only last so long. By the early 1970s, Priscilla was restless. She had spent over a decade in Elvis's world, a world that revolved around him. She wanted something of her own, an identity not tethered to the king's shadow. She began taking karate lessons, an interest Elvis himself shared. The classes offered her independence, movement, and a taste of life beyond Graceland's gilded walls. And there she met Mike Stone. At first, it was innocent. Stone was her instructor, a man who embodied discipline, strength, and a confidence Priscilla found refreshing. But soon, the friendship deepened into something else, something that gave her the attention and respect she no longer felt she had at home. It was around this time that Elvis began to notice changes. He could sense Priscilla slipping away, her eyes drifting, her mood altered. For a man whose world had always revolved around adoration, the idea that his wife might be giving her heart to another man was unbearable. And yet Elvis himself had long been guilty of straying. The irony was sharp, but in his mind it was different. He was Elvis Presley. The rules weren't the same for him. Still, when the suspicion became real, when whispers reached his ears, when he saw with his own eyes, everything collapsed. That night in Las Vegas, when he looked into the crowd and saw Priscilla seated with another man, all those years of imbalance and betrayal came crashing together. The young girl he had once guided, the woman he had married, the mother of his child, was now sitting beside someone else. And in that moment, Elvis's power failed him. The king lost his voice. But what exactly happened after he skipped that song? What choices did Elvis make when the spotlight dimmed, when the stage curtain fell, when the world wasn't looking? The truth is far more explosive than most fans ever imagined. Elvis Presley was no stranger to heartbreak. Fame had taught him that love, at least the kind the world recognized, was fragile. Fans loved him, women adored him, the world placed him on a pedestal, but the price of being loved by millions was often being left alone by the one person who mattered most. And yet, nothing could have prepared him for the moment when suspicion became reality. The whispers started small, a phone call here, a casual remark from a friend there, rumors that Priscilla was spending time with someone new. At first, Elvis brushed it off. He had heard plenty of gossip in his life, most of it untrue, and he knew people were eager to tarnish his marriage. But doubt is a dangerous seed. Once planted, it grows in silence, in shadows, until it consumes everything. By 1971, the tension between Elvis and Priscilla was undeniable. Elvis was pouring his soul into his music, particularly his live performances in Las Vegas, but behind the stage lights, he felt the weight of betrayal pressing down. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury himself in songs that spoke of loyalty and devotion. But then he would see her face, Priscilla's face, in the crowd, and alongside her, a man who wasn't supposed to be there. The man was Mike Stone. To Elvis, he was no stranger. In fact, Elvis had initially admired him. Stone was a disciplined karate champion, a man who had trained alongside Elvis himself. He was part of the same martial arts community that Elvis respected deeply. But when Stone became more than a teacher to Priscilla, when their conversations turned into confidences and their closeness became undeniable, Elvis felt the sting of betrayal in its purest form. Here was not just any man, but someone from his own circle, a man he trusted enough to be around his family, a man who, in Elvis's mind, should have known better. And yet, the story wasn't so simple. Because while Elvis felt betrayed, the truth was that Priscilla's relationship with Mike Stone didn't appear out of nowhere. It was born of years of neglect, years of living in a mansion that felt like a gilded cage, years of being the silent wife, while Elvis indulged his own desires without consequence. This was the irony Elvis couldn't face. He had strayed more times than Priscilla could count, justifying it as part of the lifestyle. He had dismissed her loneliness, her pleas for attention, her longing for a life of her own. And now, when she finally sought affection elsewhere, Elvis's world came crashing down. Still, Elvis couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that irony. To him, this wasn't just betrayal, It was a humiliation, a wound to his pride, a threat to the very identity he had built as the man who could command love wherever he went. It was on stage, night after night, where this torment revealed itself most. The songs that once flowed effortlessly now carried the weight of suspicion. When he sang about heartbreak, the words trembled with a rawness that fans noticed but couldn't fully understand. When he sang about devotion, it felt like a lie even to him. And then came that night when he skipped the song. The silence between notes was louder than any lyric he could have sung. But the unraveling didn't stop there. The closer Elvis looked, the more signs he saw. Priscilla's growing independence, her coldness in private moments, the way her eyes seemed to wander elsewhere. For a man already plagued by insecurity, this was unbearable. He began to lash out, sometimes in anger, sometimes in desperate pleas. He asked her questions he already knew the answers to. He demanded explanations that only deepened the rift. Priscilla, for her part, began to admit that she was unhappy, that she wanted something different, something more than being the shadow of the king. This was the cruelest cut of all. Because Elvis had always believed, deep down, that no matter what he did, Priscilla would stay, that their bond, formed when she was so young, would hold her to him forever. The realization that she was no longer bound, no longer willing to sacrifice herself for him, it shattered his illusion of control. And yet, just as the truth was about to come fully into the open, Elvis's story takes a turn. Because to understand the explosion that followed, you have to look at Elvis himself, not just as a husband betrayed, but as a man who had been unraveling long before Priscilla ever met Mike Stone. Here, where the irony cuts the deepest. Long before he discovered Priscilla's secret, Elvis was already struggling with his own demons. His affairs were not just about desire. They were about loneliness, about trying to fill a void that no stage, no fan, no song could ever satisfy. He surrounded himself with women, yes, but also with pills, with late nights, with distractions that dulled the pain of being both worshipped and utterly isolated. Elvis's fame was both a crown and a cage. It gave him everything, yet it left him craving the one thing he could never fully possess: unconditional love. Not the screaming devotion of strangers, not the fleeting passion of affairs, but a love that was constant, grounding, real. And for a time, he thought he had found that in Priscilla. But as their lives became increasingly fractured, he sought comfort elsewhere, never realizing that each choice was pushing her closer to the edge of leaving. So when Priscilla found Mike Stone, it wasn't just betrayal. It was a mirror, a reflection of everything Elvis had done, staring back at him with brutal clarity. But Elvis didn't see it that way, not then. To him, it was war. The unraveling turned violent, not in the sense of physical harm, but in the depth of rage Elvis carried. He confided to close friends that he wanted Stone dead. He spoke of revenge in words that chilled those around him. The king of rock and roll, the man adored by millions, was whispering in dark corners about hiring a hitman. Was he serious? Some said yes. Others believed it was talk, fueled by anger and pride. But the fact that Elvis entertained such thoughts showed just how deeply the betrayal had cut him. Still, even in his darkest moments, Elvis hesitated. Something held him back. Perhaps it was his upbringing, the values instilled by his mother, the moral line he couldn't cross. Or perhaps, deep down, he knew the real enemy wasn't Mike Stone. It was the emptiness inside him. And this is where the story twists again. Because just as Elvis's fury reached its peak, just as he seemed ready to confront Stone, or Priscilla, or both, the narrative fractures. Instead of delivering the confrontation we expect, Elvis pulls back. And in that silence, we are reminded of something important. Elvis Presley was not just a betrayed husband. He was a man caught between his public image and his private despair. And in those years, that despair often took the shape of pills, of long nights in Graceland, of searching for answers he could never find. So the question becomes, was Priscilla's betrayal the breaking point, or was it simply the moment that exposed the cracks already running through Elvis's soul? That's the cruel beauty of this story. Because just when we think we've uncovered the whole truth, Priscilla and Mike Stone, Elvis's rage, the skipped song, we realize there's more, much more. The unraveling wasn't just about an affair. It was about two people trapped in a marriage built on imbalance from the start. A marriage where one gave everything and the other believed he could always take without consequence. When Priscilla finally found the courage to step away, it wasn't just rebellion, it was survival. And for Elvis, it wasn't just heartbreak, it was a revelation of how much he had already lost. The skipped song on stage was only the beginning. What came after would test Elvis's sanity, his faith, his ability to forgive, and it would lead to one of the darkest, most shocking chapters of his life. When the truth could no longer be denied, when whispers turned into confessions, Elvis Presley was consumed by a storm unlike any he had faced before. Mike Stone was not just a rumor anymore, he was real. He was the man who had stepped into the sacred space Elvis thought belonged only to him. And worse, he was someone Elvis had welcomed, someone he had allowed into his orbit. That betrayal burned hotter than anything else. The revelation sent Elvis into a spiral. Friends remember him packing Graceland, unable to sit still, his voice rising and falling as he replayed the humiliation in his mind. He would speak in bursts, sometimes threatening, sometimes pleading, sometimes whispering in disbelief, as though saying it aloud would make it untrue. But it was true. Priscilla, for all her grace and loyalty through the years, had chosen someone else. For Elvis, this wasn't just a wife's betrayal. It was a wound to his pride, his masculinity, his very identity. He had always believed he could hold the world in his hands. Women fell at his feet. Fans screamed his name until they fainted. Presidents and kings welcomed him as an equal. Yet in the one place where it mattered most, in his marriage, he had been left behind. That was the sting he couldn't forgive. And so, in the darkness of his anger, Elvis did the unthinkable. He began to speak of violence. Friends recall chilling conversations. Elvis, his voice low and trembling with rage, saying he wanted Mike Stone gone, not just out of Priscilla's life, but out of this world. He asked questions no husband should ever ask. Who could make it happen? How much would it cost? At first, his inner circle thought he was venting, a man heartbroken, exaggerating his fury. But as the days passed, it became clear Elvis was serious. He was entertaining the thought of hiring someone to kill the man who had stolen his wife's affection. Joe Esposito, one of Elvis's closest aides, later admitted that Elvis had looked him in the eye and said, "I want him dead, Joe. I want him gone." The king of rock and roll, beloved, idolized, immortal in the eyes of fans, was contemplating murder. But something inside Elvis hesitated. He could rage, he could threaten, he could fantasize about revenge. But to cross that line, to take a life, it wasn't who he truly was. Deep down, he still carried the lessons of his mother, the faith instilled in him as a boy from Tupelo. Even in his darkest hours, that part of him wouldn't let go. So he stopped short. He didn't act, but the fact that he had even considered it shows just how far he had fallen. And then there was Priscilla's side. For years, her voice had been muted by Elvis's fame. She was the wife in the background, the mother of his child, the one expected to smile and endure. But now, for the first time, she spoke her truth. Priscilla admitted openly that she had felt invisible, that she had given everything to Elvis, her youth, her identity, her freedom, and in return, she was often left alone. Surrounded by women he flirted with, affairs she could no longer ignore, and a husband whose love felt conditional, she had been drowning. Mike Stone hadn't been a predator. He had been, in her eyes, a rescuer, a man who listened when Elvis didn't, a man who treated her not as an ornament, but as a woman with feelings, desires, and dignity. It's easy to judge her choice, to brand her as unfaithful, as disloyal, but to understand her is to understand the impossible life she was living, married to the most famous man in the world, yet lonelier than she had ever been. For Priscilla, Stone wasn't just a man, he was proof that she still mattered, proof that she could still be loved. The fallout between Elvis and Priscilla was volcanic. Arguments erupted behind closed doors at Graceland. Elvis accused, shouted, demanded. Priscilla defended, explained, cried. Their daughter, Lisa Marie, was caught in the middle of a storm she couldn't comprehend. In public, they kept up appearances, but in private, the marriage was broken beyond repair. Every word was a dagger, every silence was heavier than any shout. And then came the moment when Priscilla finally said the words Elvis had feared most: "I'm leaving." For a man who had once believed no one could walk away from him, it was an unbearable blow. Elvis tried to win her back. He offered promises of change, begged her to stay, even softened his tone in rare moments of vulnerability. But Priscilla had made up her mind. The woman who had once been molded by him now stood on her own, and she wanted out. The divorce that followed was messy, but it was also strangely tender. When they walked into the courtroom in 1973, hand in hand, it stunned everyone. They were no longer lovers, no longer husband and wife, but they were still bound by history, by a daughter, by something deeper than the paperwork could erase. Yet behind that civility lay a man shattered. Elvis never recovered from Priscilla's departure, not truly. The world saw the jumpsuits, the concerts, the flashing smile. But behind the curtain, Elvis was drowning. He turned more heavily to pills, to long nights of restless wandering around Graceland, to desperate attempts to fill the void she had left. Friends recall him playing Heartbreak songs alone at the piano, tears streaming down his face. They remember him asking again and again, "Why wasn't I enough? Why did she leave?" And perhaps the cruelest irony of all was this: Elvis had built a career on songs of love, heartbreak, and devotion. He could make the world cry with a ballad, but in his own life, he couldn't hold on to the one love that mattered most. That skipped song in Las Vegas became a symbol, a moment when the king, who could sing through anything, pain, exhaustion, even illness, was silenced by heartbreak. But the story doesn't end there. Because just when it seemed Elvis had lost everything, just when his marriage was gone and his rage had cooled into sorrow, he was presented with an impossible choice. Should he forgive, or should he carry the bitterness with him until the end? Friends urged him to let go, to move on, to find peace in the knowledge that he and Priscilla still shared love as parents, if not as partners. But Elvis struggled. His pride screamed for vengeance. His heart begged for reconciliation. And in the middle stood Lisa Marie, the daughter he adored, the one person who could still soften his hardened heart. For her sake, he tried to be civil, to keep the peace. But inside, the battle raged on. It was the battle between forgiveness and fury, between letting go and holding on, between the man his fans believed him to be and the broken soul he had become. Elvis Presley, king of rock and roll, idol of millions, was left with a choice no crown could shield him from: to forgive the woman who had betrayed him, or to let that betrayal define the rest of his life. And the truth of what he chose would shape not only his final years, but the legacy he left behind. Elvis Presley had faced betrayal, he had faced rage, he had faced the collapse of the one relationship he thought would last forever. But what he carried beyond the courtroom, beyond the skipped song, beyond the nights of grief at Graceland, was something deeper than heartbreak. It was the question that haunted him until the very end: was he the victim of betrayal or the architect of it? Because while Elvis could never forgive Priscilla for turning to Mike Stone, he also could not escape the truth that his own actions had pushed her there. This is the tragedy of Elvis Presley. He sang songs of eternal love, yet lived a life where love always seemed just out of reach. After the divorce, Elvis tried to move forward. He dated other women: Linda Thompson, Ginger Alden, fleeting romances that filled the tabloids but never filled his soul. Each new love was compared to Priscilla, and each one fell short. He still called her, still sought her advice, still asked for her presence at key moments. And when Priscilla appeared, whether at Graceland or at Lisa Marie's events, Elvis's eyes softened in a way his fans rarely saw. It was clear she was still the one he measured all others against. And yet, every time he looked at her, he remembered the man in the audience, He remembered the night his voice broke in silence. That wound never healed. But here's the twist, the part most people don't know. The skipped song wasn't just about Priscilla. It wasn't even just about Mike Stone. It was about Elvis himself. Because in that moment, when he stared into the crowd and chose silence over song, Elvis wasn't only looking at his wife with another man. He was looking at a mirror. A mirror reflecting his own choices, the affairs, the neglect, the loneliness he had created in the very person he thought he owned. In that second of silence, Elvis Presley was confronted not only with betrayal, but with himself. That's why he couldn't sing, because no lyric, no melody, no stage presence could drown out the truth. In the years that followed, that silence echoed louder than any applause. Elvis's performances grew more intense, more desperate, as though he was trying to sing away the ghosts of his past. Fans noticed the cracks, his trembling voice, his fading stamina, his emotional breakdowns on stage. And yet those cracks made his songs more powerful. When he sang about heartbreak, it wasn't performance anymore, it was confession. When he sang about love, it wasn't a promise, it was a plea. The king was unraveling before their eyes, and the skipped song became a symbol of everything he could not say out loud. Priscilla, for her part, carried her own burden. She had broken free, yes. She had found independence, built her own identity beyond Elvis's shadow, but she also carried guilt. She admitted later that leaving him was not easy, that a part of her would always love him. And when Elvis died in 1977, just 4 years after their divorce, Priscilla wept as though a piece of her had been buried with him. Because no matter how broken their marriage became, no matter how much pain they inflicted on each other, they were bound forever. By history, by a child, by a love that was both intoxicating and destructive. The legacy of their story still lingers today. For Elvis fans, it remains one of the great what-ifs. What if he had forgiven? What if she had stayed? What if Elvis had conquered his demons before they consumed him? Would the king have lived longer, healthier, happier? Would Lisa Marie have grown up with her parents together instead of divided? No one knows, and maybe that's why the story endures. Because it isn't just about Elvis Presley, the superstar. It's about every person who has ever lost love, who has ever been betrayed, who has ever realized too late that they were partly to blame. The skipped song becomes a metaphor for all of us, the moments when silence says more than words, when the truth is too painful to speak, when the music of love stops without warning. And yet, even in tragedy, Elvis's story offers something profound. Because when he chose not to act on his darkest impulses, when he chose not to destroy Mike Stone, not to punish Priscilla, but instead to endure, he proved something, that even the most broken among us can choose restraint, that even the most wounded can resist revenge. He didn't forgive easily, he didn't forget, but he also didn't cross the line that would have defined him not as a king, but as a monster, and that choice, as quiet as it was, became one of his greatest legacies. The years rolled on, Elvis's health declined, his addictions worsened, but the memory of Priscilla, the wound of betrayal, never left him. Friends say he would still talk about her late at night, still replay conversations, still wonder what could have been. When he died at 42, the world mourned the legend, but those closest to him mourned something else, a man who had been searching for peace and never found it. And perhaps the cruelest part, he had already told us in his silence that he was broken. We just didn't hear it until it was too late. That is the last twist. The skipped song was never just about Priscilla, never just about Mike Stone. It was Elvis Presley's confession. His admission that he was both betrayed and betrayer, both victim and culprit, both king and prisoner. It was the one time when the man behind the legend let his silence tell the truth. And today, when we look back at that night, when we imagine the king standing frozen on stage, the crowd cheering, the band waiting, the spotlight blinding, we understand. The silence was the loudest song he ever sang. If Elvis Presley had lived long enough to explain that night himself, would we have believed him? Was he broken by betrayal, or by the weight of his own choices? I want to hear from you. If you were standing in Elvis's shoes, would you have kept singing or let silence speak? Tell me in the comments. I read every word and your voice matters here. Because sometimes the greatest truths aren't sung, they're left unspoken.